In the far northern corner of Spain and the southwestern edge of France, there's a group of people whose DNA looks like it belongs to a different Europe entirely. While almost every other population on the continent got swept up in wave after wave of migration, invasion, and mixing, this group barely moved. Their genes still carry the fingerprint of a world that existed before most of Europe's languages, before most of Europe's ancestry even existed in its current form. These are the Basques, and the story hidden in their DNA is stranger than most people realize. The Pyrenees rise up like a natural wall, cradling a homeland where time seems to move differently. Tucked beneath these mountains lives one of Europe's most persistent genetic puzzles, the Basque people, whose origins remain almost as hard to pin down as the peaks surrounding them. Unlike their neighbors across Spain and France, the Basques carry a genetic signature that looks almost frozen in place. While Indo-European migrations reshaped populations from Britain all the way to the Balkans during the Bronze Age, the Basque homeland barely absorbed any of it. Centuries later, when Muslim armies crossed into Iberia in the early 8th century and left genetic traces across much of Spain, the Basque country remained largely untouched, almost as if history slowed down at its borders. Then there's the language. Euskara isn't related to Spanish, French, or any Indo-European tongue at all. It stands completely alone, the last surviving pre-Indo-European language anywhere in Europe, a living relic that has outlasted conquest after conquest. So who exactly are the Basques? Ice Age survivors who never left? An ancient blend of hunters and farmers who somehow resisted the forces that reshaped everyone around them? Or something even older, an echo of a Europe that existed before the Europe we think we know? The deeper researchers dig, the stranger and more compelling this story gets. To understand the Basques, you have to go back tens of thousands of years, to the depths of the last ice age. Most of Europe at that time was unlivable. Glaciers carved across the landscape, temperatures collapsed, and entire populations vanished as a result. Only a handful of sheltered regions, known to researchers as refugia, allowed people to survive at all. One of those regions was the Franco-Cantabrian zone, spanning northern Spain and southwestern France, almost exactly where the Basque country sits today. The archaeological record shows that people didn't just cling on here, they built a genuine, thriving culture. Caves like Altamira and Achain are covered in paintings of bison, horses, and deer, some dating back more than 30,000 years. Using uranium series dating, researchers have placed many of these images somewhere between roughly 36,000 and 15,000 years old. These weren't just decoration, they were evidence of a resilient Ice Age culture holding on in a Europe where most other groups had already disappeared. Even earlier still, Neanderthals called this same landscape home. At Lizette Siki Cave, archaeologists have recovered Mousterian stone tools dating back more than 150,000 years. When Homo sapiens eventually arrived in the region, they overlapped with Neanderthal populations for thousands of years, and that overlap left a lasting genetic mark. Modern Europeans, Basques included, still carry roughly 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA as a result of that ancient encounter. The key point is this stretch of land functioned as a genetic refuge. While Ice Age populations elsewhere thinned out or vanished entirely, the ancestors of the Basques held on, sheltered by the Pyrenees and the resource-rich valleys of northern Iberia. As the Ice Age gave way to warmer conditions, a new transformation swept across Europe: farming. Starting around 8,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers migrating out of Anatolia and the Near East pushed westward, bringing wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and pottery with them. Across most of the continent, these incoming farmers largely replaced the hunter-gatherers who'd been there before. But the Basque homeland tells a noticeably different story. At the El Portalón cave site near Atapuerca, researchers recovered skeletal remains dating back roughly 3,500 to 5,500 years. A study led by researchers at Uppsala University, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, analyzed the genomes of these individuals and found something striking. These people carried DNA from both Neolithic farmers and the older Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Iberia, in a mix that was unusually balanced. Unlike Central and Northern Europe, where incoming farmers almost completely replaced older populations, the ancestors of today's Basques held onto a noticeably higher share of hunter-gatherer ancestry. That balance created a genetic profile that still sets Basque populations apart today. And after that initial period of mixing, something else happened: isolation. The Pyrenees acted as a natural geographic barrier, limiting large-scale migration in either direction, but culture reinforced that isolation just as strongly. Basque communities built strong local traditions and identities that resisted outside assimilation for generation after generation. That's part of why, when researchers compare the ancient El Portalón genomes to modern Basque populations, they find an almost unbroken line of genetic continuity stretching across roughly 3,000 years. Very few populations anywhere on Earth show that kind of long-term genetic stability. The Bronze Age marked Europe's next major turning point. Starting around 4,500 years ago, pastoralist groups originating from the Pontic stepped near what's now Ukraine and southern Russia, spread rapidly across the continent, bringing horses, new weapons, and Indo-European languages with them. Their ancestry reshaped populations from Britain all the way to Iberia. But the Basque country was the exception. When geneticists examined Basque genomes, they found only a small trace of this steppe ancestry, far less than almost anywhere else in Western Europe. It's as if the great Indo-European wave that reshaped the rest of the continent broke against the wall of the Pyrenees. One genetic marker illustrates just how unusual this is. Today, somewhere between 60 and 70% of Basque men, and in some specific provinces even higher, carry a Y chromosome lineage called R1b DF27. That's one of the highest concentrations of any single paternal lineage recorded anywhere in Europe. What makes it even more striking is how little internal diversity that lineage shows in the Basque region specifically. Genetic studies estimate that DF27 likely originated somewhere in northeastern Iberia around 4,200 years ago, right at the boundary between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and then expanded rapidly from a relatively small founding group. This is part of why researchers sometimes describe the Basques as something close to a genetic time capsule. Their Y chromosome landscape looks like it locked into place thousands of years ago, while the surrounding regions of Europe kept shifting and blending. Other, much smaller lineages do show up in Basque populations, including some linked to North African ancestry found in low frequencies in areas like Álava and Biscay, but these remain minor threads, rather than anything that disrupts the dominant genetic pattern. What makes the Basques genuinely unusual isn't total isolation. It's something more precise, selective insulation. Enough outside contact to survive and adapt, but not enough to be swept up in the sweeping demographic transformations that reshaped their neighbors. If DNA explains how the Basques stayed distinct, their language helps explain why. Euskara, or Basque, is Europe's last surviving pre-Indo-European language, and it truly stands alone. Unlike Spanish, French, or German, all of which belong to the vast Indo-European language family, Euskara has no confirmed living relatives anywhere. Linguists have spent well over a century trying to connect it to something else: Georgian in the Caucasus, Berber languages in North Africa, even Sumerian in ancient Mesopotamia. Occasionally, faint structural similarities appear, like its use of ergative grammar, a feature it shares with some Caucasian languages, but none of these proposed connections have held up under scrutiny. Euskara remains a genuine linguistic orphan, a fossil language that has somehow survived intact into the modern era. And it has survived against real odds. Today, roughly 750,000 people speak Euskara across northern Spain and southwestern France. What's especially interesting is that Euskara isn't a single uniform language. It splits into several major dialects, some different enough from each other to be barely mutually understandable. Despite that internal variation, the language as a whole has held onto its core structure for thousands of years, resisting the pressure of Latin, Arabic, and the surrounding Romance languages that swept across the rest of Iberia over the centuries. A notable 2021 study published in the journal Current Biology found that the boundaries between Euskara dialects line up closely with genetic clusters found in Basque villages. In other words, the language wasn't just a cultural label sitting on top of the population. It actively reinforced the population structure. Villages that shared a dialect tended to intermarry more within that group, creating a feedback loop where language shaped genetics, and genetics in turn reinforce language. Very few populations anywhere in the world show this strong connection between speech patterns and DNA. Euskara's survival also reflects a broader pattern of Basque resistance to outside rule. When Rome conquered Iberia, Latin replaced local languages almost everywhere, from Gaul down to Portugal. But in the Basque valleys, Euskara held on. During the period of Moorish rule beginning in the 8th century, Arabic reshaped much of Spain's vocabulary and culture. Yet Euskara absorbed remarkably little of it. Even centuries later, when the Spanish state actively suppressed the language in schools, it survived underground, passed quietly from parents to children. It became more than just a means of communication. It functioned as a kind of cultural shield, a living barrier that helped preserve Basque identity across thousands of years of outside pressure. Science can explain how the Basques endured. Their traditional stories reveal how they understood that endurance themselves and their folklore is just as distinctive as their DNA and language. High in the Pyrenees, caves were said to be home to Mari, a mountain goddess who wasn't a distant, abstract figure, but a tangible presence, sometimes appearing as a woman with long hair, sometimes as fire streaking across the night sky. She was believed to control the weather, maintain balance across the land, and punish those who broke trust within the community. In a culture that valued resilience and honesty above almost everything else, Mari represented both survival and moral order. Alongside her was Sugar, often pictured as a serpent or dragon associated with storms, lightning, and a more restless, changeable energy. Where Mari represented permanence, Sugar represented change, and together the two figures symbolized a balance between stability and transformation, themes that line up remarkably well with what genetics actually tells us about Basque history, a people who stayed rooted in place, while still adapting just enough to survive. Then there were the Gentilak, giants said to have lived in the region before the arrival of Christianity. According to legend, they built the dolmens, the large stone monuments still scattered across Basque hillsides today. When the Christian cross appeared in the region, the Gentilak were said to have hurled boulders across the mountains before retreating into caves and vanishing from human sight entirely. Archaeology confirms that these dolmens genuinely do date back to the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, tying the old folklore directly to real material history. Other figures populated Basque tradition too. Lamiak, river spirits with bird-like feet, said to bless or curse people depending on how they were treated, and Sorganak, witches believed to serve Marie through nighttime rituals in the mountains. Spirits invoked to explain storms, fertility, and misfortune in a world without modern science. These weren't just entertaining tales. They tied the Basque people to their land, their caves, their rivers, and their mountains, and strikingly, both the archaeology and the genetics line up with what these old stories describe: deep continuity, real antiquity, and survival against long odds. Modern genetic research shows that today's Basque population closely resembles Iron Age populations from the same region, with a genetic profile that has stayed remarkably stable for well over 3,000 years. Roughly 70% of Basque men still carry that same R1b DF27 lineage, tracing back to the Bronze Age founder event. At the same time, Basques share somewhere around 70% of their overall genome with neighboring Spanish and French populations. What sets them apart isn't some exotic addition. It's what's largely missing: minimal Indo-European steppe ancestry, and very little detectable Moorish genetic influence. In genetics, sometimes absence tells a louder story than presence, and in folklore, the things left unsaid often hint at truths that science only confirms much later. The old Basque stories about timelessness and resilience weren't just exaggeration. They reflect a reality that archaeology and genetics now back up in detail: a people held in place by geography, culture, and belief, working together. Almost every population in Europe carries the genetic fingerprints of repeated migration. The people of Britain carry steppe ancestry from Bronze Age herders. Italians carry genetic input from Greek, Roman, and North African contact over the centuries. Spaniards, more broadly, show genetic traces from centuries of Moorish rule. In most corners of Europe, DNA reads almost like a stack of sediment layers: migration piled on migration, mixture piled on mixture. The Basque country resisted much of that layering. Their DNA offers something genuinely rare, something closer to a snapshot of Europe before the major reshaping migrations of the Bronze Age and beyond. Geneticists often treat Basque populations as a kind of natural baseline, a reference point against which the genetic history of other European populations can be measured. By comparing Basques to their neighbors, researchers can estimate how much mixing and population replacement happened elsewhere across the continent, and just how unusual it is to find a population whose ancestry has stayed this stable for so long. The numbers back this up. Genetic analyses show that modern Basques resemble Iron Age Iberians more closely than they resemble many of their immediate Spanish or French neighbors today. Around 70% of Basque men still carry R1b DF27, the same lineage that took hold more than 4,000 years ago. Genome-wide studies confirm that the broader Basque genetic profile has shifted only modestly over at least the last 3,000 years, a level of long-term continuity that's genuinely rare in a continent where most populations have been reshaped multiple times over. And yet the Basques aren't some population frozen in amber, disconnected from the world around them. They still share roughly 70% of their genome with other Iberian populations. They are, in every sense, European, just distinctively so, set apart less by what they gained and more by what they never fully absorbed. Minimal Bronze Age steppe ancestry, little North African admixture, and comparatively limited Roman genetic influence. It's a reminder that identity isn't only built from what gets added onto a population over time. Sometimes it's built just as much from what gets preserved and protected against outside change. For science, this makes the Basque population genuinely valuable. They help answer some fundamental questions about European prehistory. How exactly did early farming populations mix with the hunter-gatherers already living in a region? What did Europe look like linguistically before Indo-European languages spread across the continent? How much of Europe's genetic diversity today comes down to migration, and how much comes down to isolation? But culturally, the Basques offer a different kind of lesson entirely. They demonstrate that language, geography, and identity can act as forces every bit as powerful as armies and empires. The Pyrenees provided a physical shield. Euskara functioned as a cultural firewall, discouraging assimilation generation after generation. Myth and tradition anchored the population firmly to its homeland. Together, these forces effectively slowed down the pace of historical change itself, at least within this one corner of Europe. In a modern world where languages disappear at an alarming rate and local cultures blend into broader, more homogeneous ones, the Basques stand as a reminder that resilience is genuinely possible, not only in genetics, but in cultural identity as well. They're proof that a population can preserve a distinct sense of self even while surrounded by empires, invasions, and centuries of outside pressure. The Basques matter today not just as a genetic curiosity for researchers to study, but as a living connection to Europe's deep past, a bridge stretching from Ice Age hunters through early Neolithic farmers, all the way to the present day. They're a reminder that Europe's story isn't only about constant change, it's also, in places, a story about endurance. So are the Basques the last true descendants of some of Europe's earliest farming populations? Are they the inheritors of Ice Age hunters who found lasting shelter in the Pyrenees? Or have they preserved something even older, something that genetic testing alone still can't fully capture? The evidence keeps pointing toward the same conclusion. A people shaped as much by what they resisted as by what they absorbed, holding on to a genetic and cultural identity that has outlasted almost everything that reshaped the rest of the continent around them.